You ever notice how the loudest men in a Marine Corps mess hall are usually the ones who've never heard real silence before? The laughter rolled across the crowded chow hall at Camp Pendleton like loose brass on concrete, sharp and careless beneath the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Rain hammered the windows overlooking the dark runway outside, and every few seconds the distant thunder of helicopter rotors vibrated faintly through the steel beams overhead. Marines fresh off a 12-hour field exercise packed the room shoulder to shoulder, trays clattering, boots scraping, voices loud with exhaustion and ego. Near the back corner, away from the television screens and the officers' tables, an old man sat alone beneath a faded Marine Corps recruiting poster from another decade. He wore a weathered olive-green maintenance jacket with his name stitched above the pocket in nearly invisible thread. E. Mercer. His white hair was cut short. His posture wasn't military straight anymore, but there was still something balanced about him, something controlled. Like an old rifle that had been cleaned so many times the metal no longer needed oil to move smoothly. He ate slowly, methodically, barely looking up from the chipped ceramic bowl of chili in front of him. Captain Ryan Cole noticed him the second he walked into the mess hall. 29 years old, decorated twice, respected on base, and fully aware of it. Rainwater still glistened on his tan uniform sleeves as he stopped beside the officers' section carrying a tray stacked with black coffee and overcooked eggs. Around him clustered half a dozen younger Marines eager to laugh at whatever came out of his mouth next. Cole tilted his head toward the old man. Who invited Grandpa into the officer section? A few chuckles answered immediately. Elias Mercer didn't react. Didn't even blink. He simply lifted his spoon again while rain rattled the glass behind him. Something about the silence irritated Cole instantly. Young officers were used to reactions. Nervousness. Respect. Explanations. But the old man acted as if none of them existed. Cole stepped closer. "Sir," he said loudly, drawing more attention from nearby tables. "This section's reserved for active duty officers. You lost or something?" More laughter spread through the room. A lance corporal nearly spit coffee through his nose. Still nothing from Elias. Just that same calm expression, pale blue eyes fixed somewhere beyond the windows where runway lights glowed through the rain haze outside. Cole smirked and set his tray down on the table with a sharp crack. "You deaf too?" he asked. "Or just ignoring Marines now?" At another table, Gunnery Sergeant Noah Briggs looked up briefly from his meal. He recognized the old maintenance contractor. Everybody on base did. Quiet old guy. Fixed generators sometimes. Kept mostly to himself near the airfield hangars. Briggs had never once heard him raise his voice. Cole folded his arms. "Let me guess," he continued. "Vietnam guy?" One Marine snorted. "Probably supply division." "Nah," another said. "Motor pool maybe." More laughter. The old man finally looked up then. Slow. Steady. Eyes clear as cold glass. He studied Captain Cole the way older men sometimes studied storms rolling over the ocean. Not angry. Not intimidated. Just patient. Cole smiled wider, mistaking silence for weakness. "So what was it then?" he asked. "You got some old-school war hero nickname? Some badass call sign from the good old days?" He leaned closer over the table now, enjoying the audience gathering around them. "Come on, old-timer," he said with a grin sharp enough to cut wire. "What did they call you back then?" The rain outside intensified against the runway windows while somewhere in the distance a helicopter engine slowly began to spool up in the dark. The helicopter outside rose into a deeper whine, its rotor blades chopping slowly through the rain-soaked darkness beyond the runway windows. Nobody in the mess hall spoke for a second. Captain Ryan Cole still leaned over the table with that same smug half-grin on his face, waiting for the old man to answer the joke. Around him, Marines watched with the restless anticipation of men expecting entertainment after a long, miserable day in the field. Elias Mercer sat perfectly still beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Steam curled quietly from the untouched bowl in front of him. His pale blue eyes drifted past Cole for the briefest moment, toward the flight line outside, where amber runway lights shimmered across wet concrete. The old man inhaled slowly through his nose. Jet fuel. Rainwater. Burnt coffee. The sounds of the room seemed very far away for an instant. Then he spoke. "A long time ago," he said quietly, "people used call signs because radios were crowded." His voice carried none of the shakiness most expected from an 82-year-old man. It was low, calm, smooth flat by decades of saying only what mattered. Captain Cole chuckled immediately. Oh, here we go. Some of the younger Marines laughed with him. One slapped the table. Another muttered something about old war movies. Elias ignored all of them. Most names were temporary, he continued. Some stayed longer than they should have. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs looked up again from across the hall. There was something strange about the old man's tone now. Not proud. Not nostalgic. Heavy. Like somebody opening a rusted steel locker that had stayed shut for 50 years. Cole pulled out the empty chair across from him and sat down backward with his arms folded across the top rail. So what was yours? He pressed. You had to have one. Every old Marine loves talking about that stuff. Elias studied him quietly. Rain streaked sideways against the windows behind the captain, while thunder rolled somewhere out over the Pacific. The old man's hands rested motionless beside the ceramic bowl. Thick knuckles. White scars faded nearly invisible with age. The kind of hands built by years of engines, steel, rope burns, and hard climates. Captain Cole noticed a patch stitched onto the sleeve of the old maintenance jacket then, barely visible beneath the worn fabric. Black thread faded almost gray with time. A coiled snake. Cole squinted at it. What is that? He asked with a grin. Looks like a gas station logo. A few Marines nearby laughed again. One leaned over for a better look. Elias glanced down at the patch for half a second. Something unreadable moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Something older than anger. Old unit patch, he said simply. Cole smirked wider. Right. Secret squirrel stuff. He reached out before anybody could stop him and pinched the edge of the jacket sleeve between two fingers, lifting it slightly so the others could see the faded serpent emblem more clearly beneath the overhead lights. You know, Cole said loudly. Every retired guy on base suddenly turns into some classified legend after 2 beers. More laughter spread through the hall. But this time it did not last as long. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs had stopped eating completely now. His eyes remained locked on the old patch. The color slowly drained from his face. Because he recognized it. Not from deployment. Not from personal experience. From somewhere buried deep inside old reconnaissance briefings and restricted Marine Corps history, lectures most officers never paid attention to. Briggs stood slowly from his table. Captain Cole did not notice. He was still grinning at the old man across from him. Come on, Cole said. What did they call you? Elias Mercer looked at him for a long moment while the sound of helicopter rotors echoed faintly through the rain outside. Then the old veteran finally answered. Iron Viper. The laughter vanished instantly. For a few long seconds, the only sound inside the mess hall was the rain hammering against the runway windows and the distant pulse of helicopter rotors somewhere beyond the flight line. Captain Ryan Cole stared at the old man across from him, still waiting for the punchline that never came. Iron Viper, he repeated with a crooked grin. That is your big scary call sign. A couple Marines forced out uncertain laughs, but the energy in the room had shifted now. The humor was thinner, uneasy, like men laughing in church because they suddenly realized they should not be speaking so loudly. Elias Mercer lowered his eyes back to the untouched bowl in front of him. His expression never changed. Across the hall, Gunnery Sergeant Noah Briggs felt a cold knot tighten behind his ribs. Iron Viper. He had heard those words before. Not in stories traded between drunk corporals. Not in old movies. In briefing rooms with secured doors and classified slides where senior reconnaissance instructors spoke quietly and never answered follow-up questions. Briggs remembered sitting in a dark auditorium at Quantico 15 years earlier while an aging Force Recon colonel paused beside a grainy black and white photograph projected on the wall. 5 Marines standing knee-deep in jungle mud beside a damaged helicopter. Faces impossible to make out beneath rain and shadow. The colonel had tapped the image once with a laser pointer and said only 3 words. Iron Viper Actual. Then he had moved on without explanation. Briggs never forgot the silence in that room afterward. Back at the table, Captain Cole leaned back in the chair and smirked at the younger Marines watching nearby. Sounds like a comic book villain, he said. What did you do? Scare enemy radio operators with dramatic nicknames. This time almost nobody laughed. Elias slowly folded his napkin beside the bowl. The overhead lights reflected faintly in his pale eyes. No, he said quietly. Mostly we tried bringing people home. Something about the way he said it erased the last traces of amusement from the nearest tables. The old man did not sound nostalgic. He sounded tired, deeply tired, like someone remembering storms nobody else in the room could even imagine. Captain Cole noticed the silence finally and frowned slightly. "Relax," he muttered to the others. "You all acting like this guy is some secret legend." Elias said nothing. Outside, lightning flickered faintly over the runway. For half a second the mess hall windows flashed silver, illuminating the old Marine's weathered face in sharp detail. Briggs saw it clearly then. Not fear, not insecurity. The complete absence of any need to impress another human being. That was what unsettled him most. Young Marines bragged. Officers measured each other constantly. But older combat veterans sometimes carried a different kind of silence. A silence that did not ask permission to exist. Briggs stood slowly from his chair. Nearby Marines glanced at him in confusion. The gunnery sergeant kept staring at Elias Mercer. At the faded serpent patch on the old jacket sleeve. At the impossible calm in the man's posture. "Captain," Briggs said carefully, "maybe let it go." Ryan Cole turned toward him immediately, surprised by the interruption. "What?" "I said let it go." Cole gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Gunny, come on. We are just talking." Briggs did not answer right away. He could hear his own pulse now beneath the distant storm outside. Because another memory had surfaced. A sentence buried deep in an old reconnaissance lecture from years earlier. If you ever hear that call sign from somebody still breathing, show respect first and ask questions second. Briggs had assumed it was myth back then. Marine Corps folklore. The kind of ghost story older operators used to intimidate younger men. But standing here now, looking at Elias Mercer beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, he no longer felt certain. Captain Cole noticed Briggs staring at the old man and smirked again. "What?" he asked. "You actually know him or something?" Briggs looked at Elias one more time. Then he slowly reached for the secure phone clipped at his belt. "No," he said quietly. "But somebody higher than both of us probably does." The rain intensified outside until the windows of the mess hall rattled softly in their frames. And somewhere beyond the runway another helicopter lifted into the black California sky with a low mechanical thunder that vibrated through the floor beneath the Marine's boots. Gunnery Sergeant Noah Briggs stepped away from the table slowly, never taking his eyes off Elias Mercer. Around him, conversations had started again in cautious fragments, but the room no longer sounded relaxed. Marines who had been laughing 30 seconds earlier now watched the old man with quiet uncertainty. Captain Ryan Cole leaned back in his chair and shook his head with an irritated smile. "You all seriously buying this?" he asked. "Iron Viper? Come on." Elias did not answer. He simply reached for the coffee mug beside his tray and lifted it with both hands. The steam drifted upward through the harsh fluorescent light while rainwater traced silver lines down the dark windows behind him. Briggs moved toward the hallway outside the mess hall, unclipping the secured phone from his belt with fingers that suddenly felt colder than they should have. He stepped through the heavy metal door into the corridor where the noise of the chow hall became muffled behind concrete walls. The hallway smelled faintly of floor wax, wet canvas, and old machinery. Briggs exhaled slowly and dialed a number he had not used in almost 6 years. The line rang once, twice. Then a clipped voice answered immediately. "Operations desk." Briggs lowered his voice instinctively. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Noah Briggs at Pendleton. I need verification on a possible reconnaissance identifier." Silence for half a second. "Proceed." Briggs glanced back through the small, wired glass window in the door. He could still see Elias sitting calmly at the table, while Captain Cole continued talking loudly to the younger Marines around him. "The identifier is Iron Viper," Briggs said quietly. Nothing happened at first. Then the voice on the other end changed completely. "Repeat that." Briggs swallowed once. "Iron Viper." A longer silence followed this time. Briggs heard keyboard clicks in the distance. Another voice farther away, asking a question too muffled to understand. Then the operator came back on the line, lower now. More careful. "What is the source of the identifier?" Briggs looked through the glass again at the faded serpent patch stitched onto the old maintenance jacket. "Male. White. Approximately 80 years old. Name tape reads Mercer. Elias Mercer." The hallway suddenly felt much colder. The operator stopped typing. Briggs could actually hear the silence through the phone line now. Then quietly, almost cautiously, the operator asked, "Describe the patch." Briggs narrowed his eyes toward the old man's sleeve. "Black serpent. Circular coil. worn nearly gray. Another silence. Longer this time. Briggs heard movement in the background. Somebody speaking quickly away from the receiver. Then the operator returned, his voice no longer casual in any way. "Gunny," he said carefully, "do not allow that man to leave the base." Briggs blinked once. "Excuse me." "You heard me." The line crackled faintly. "Stand by for direct command authorization." Before Briggs could respond, the call disconnected entirely. He stared at the phone in his hand for a moment while rain pounded the roof overhead like distant rotor wash. Back inside the mess hall, Captain Cole had stood up again. "I am telling you," he said loudly to the others. "Every old guy around military bases thinks he was some Black Ops legend." A few Marines laughed nervously. Elias Mercer remained seated, unmoving beneath the fluorescent lights. Then something else happened. Every television mounted inside the mess hall flickered at the exact same moment. The sports broadcast vanished into static for half a second before black screens appeared across the room. Several Marines frowned and looked upward in confusion. Captain Cole paused mid-sentence. Then the overhead speakers crackled softly. A calm automated voice echoed through the chow hall. "Attention, all personnel. Command staff movement protocol is now active." The entire room fell silent again. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs stared through the window at Elias Mercer while a slow chill moved down his spine. Because only one thing on base triggered command movement protocol during a storm at nearly 10 o'clock at night. Somebody very high-ranking was already on the way. The automated announcement faded from the overhead speakers, but the silence it left behind settled over the mess hall heavier than before. Marines glanced at one another across trays and coffee cups while rain hammered the runway windows hard enough to blur the lights outside into streaks of gold and white. Captain Ryan Cole stood motionless beside the table now, confusion slowly replacing the smug confidence that had carried him through the last 10 minutes. "Command movement protocol?" One Lance Corporal whispered nearby. "At this hour?" Another Marine muttered something about an inspection, but even he did not sound convinced. Gunnery Sergeant Noah Briggs stepped back into the chow hall from the corridor, his face tighter than before. He moved with controlled urgency now, the kind Marines recognized instantly, even when nobody explained it aloud. Captain Cole saw him coming and frowned. "Gunny, what is going on?" Briggs ignored the question completely. His eyes went straight to Elias Mercer, sitting quietly beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. The old man had not moved. One hand rested beside the coffee mug, while the other remained folded calmly across the worn fabric of his jacket sleeve. Outside, thunder rolled low over the Pacific coast. Then the smell hit him. Rain. Wet jungle earth. Burning aviation fuel. Elias blinked once as the sounds of Camp Pendleton slowly dissolved around him. The rattling windows disappeared first. Then the fluorescent lights. Then the voices. Suddenly he was 24 years old again, standing ankle-deep in black mud beneath a storm so violent the sky itself seemed alive. Rotor blades thundered overhead through thick jungle fog, while red emergency lights flashed across the slick metal skin of a damaged helicopter. Rainwater poured down his face in warm sheets. The radio pressed against his ear crackled with static and terrified voices layered over one another. "Actual, we cannot hold this ridge. Fuel is dropping. We lost navigation." Elias moved through the storm with a map soaked nearly transparent in his hands. Young Marines surrounded him, exhausted, covered in mud, staring at him because nobody else still sounded calm. Somewhere nearby, another helicopter engine screamed unevenly through the rain. A pilot's voice came over the radio sharp with panic. "Iron Viper actual, do you copy?" Elias remembered answering without hesitation. "I copy. Always calm. Always low. Never wasting words." Around him the jungle had glowed faintly beneath lightning flashes, while rotor wash flattened the trees like ocean waves. He remembered placing one hand against the side of the damaged helicopter as if feeling its heartbeat through the metal skin. He remembered looking toward a terrified young lieutenant standing in the rain, beside him barely old enough to shave. Victor Hale. Back then just another frightened Marine officer trying not to let his men see it. "Can you get us out?" Hale had asked over the roar of the storm. Elias remembered the smell of wet canvas and hot engine oil. The sound of distant radio chatter swallowed by thunder. The weight of exhausted Marines watching him because nobody else knew what to do next. He remembered answering the same way he answered everything in those years. Quietly. Yes. The memory shattered apart as another crack of thunder rolled over Camp Pendleton. Elias returned slowly to the present while rain streaked down the mess hall windows. Across from him, Captain Ryan Cole shifted uneasily beneath the growing silence in the room. "This is insane," Cole muttered, trying to recover control of the situation. "You all seriously acting like this old contractor is some war ghost?" Nobody answered him. Because outside, through the rain-covered glass near the runway, headlights suddenly appeared in the darkness. Multiple vehicles, black SUVs moving fast across the wet pavement with military police escorts surrounding them. Their flashing lights reflected across the soaked runway like blue lightning. Every Marine in the mess hall turned toward the windows at the same time. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs felt his stomach tighten, because he recognized the lead vehicle immediately. Command transport, not base command. Higher, much higher. Captain Cole stared toward the approaching convoy with growing confusion, while Elias Mercer quietly lifted his coffee mug again as though none of it had anything to do with him. The convoy cut through the storm like a moving wall of black steel and blue light, tires hissing across rain-soaked pavement as military police vehicles swept around the lead SUVs near the mess hall entrance. Inside the building, every conversation had stopped completely now. Marines stood frozen beside trays and tables watching the headlights spill across the wet runway outside. Captain Ryan Cole stared through the windows with growing disbelief. "Who the hell rates a response like that?" he muttered under his breath. Nobody answered him. Gunnery Sergeant Noah Briggs already knew enough to stop asking questions. The overhead lights flickered once more as thunder rolled low across the coast. Then the side entrance doors to the mess hall burst open against the wind. Rain sprayed across the tile floor as two military police officers entered first, scanning the room automatically. Behind them came a cluster of command staff officers in dark service uniforms already damp from the storm outside. The energy inside the hall changed instantly. Marines straightened unconsciously. Chairs scraped backward. Conversations died before they could even begin. Captain Cole took one step away from Elias Mercer's table, suddenly aware that every pair of eyes in the building had shifted toward the entrance. Then the final figure stepped through the doorway. Lieutenant General Victor Hale. For stars glinted beneath the harsh fluorescent lights as rainwater dripped from the brim of his cover onto the polished floor below. Even at 68 years old, Hale carried himself with the unmistakable presence of a man used to command. The room snapped to attention almost instantly. Every Marine rose from their seats in reflexive silence. Every Marine except Elias Mercer. The old veteran remained seated calmly at the table near the window with one hand wrapped around his coffee mug. General Hale did not acknowledge anyone else in the room. Not the military police. Not the officers beside him. Not the dozens of Marines standing rigidly at attention beneath the humming lights. His eyes locked directly onto Elias Mercer II. He entered the hall. And for the first time since walking through those doors, Victor Hale looked uncertain. Captain Cole swallowed hard as the general crossed the room, slowly through rows of silent Marines. Briggs watched Hale's face carefully and realized something deeply unsettling. This was not anger. This was reverence. The kind men rarely showed publicly inside the military. Hale stopped 3 feet from the old Marine's table. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his dress uniform, while thunder echoed faintly outside the windows behind him. Elias looked up slowly from the coffee mug in his hands. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then General Hale came to full attention. Perfectly straight despite his age. The movement echoed softly through the silent mess hall like a rifle bolt locking into place. Captain Cole felt the blood drain from his face, because the next thing he saw made his stomach turn cold. Lieutenant General Victor Hale raised his hand in a formal salute. Not casual, not symbolic. Full military respect. Held steady, held hard. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed loudly enough to hear themselves. The only sound was rain striking the windows and the faint mechanical hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Elias Mercer stared at the general for a moment with tired, pale eyes that had seen far too many storms. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, the old veteran set down his coffee mug and returned the salute. Several younger Marines exchanged stunned glances immediately. Captain Ryan Cole remained frozen beside the table, unable to process what he was seeing. A four-star general did not salute retired maintenance contractors in the middle of a chow hall during a storm. Not unless something far beyond ordinary rank was standing in front of him. General Hale lowered his hand first. His voice, when it finally came, sounded rougher than before. "Older. I heard a rumor," he said quietly. I did not believe it. Elias looked toward the rain-covered windows again. Most people should not. Hale gave a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though no amusement reached his eyes. "You disappeared 40 years ago," he said. "Some people thought you were dead." Elias rested both hands calmly against the table edge. "Some days I was not entirely sure myself." Around them, the entire mess hall remained locked in absolute silence, while Captain Ryan Cole slowly realized the old man he had mocked half an hour earlier was someone even a four-star general stood up for. The mess hall remained frozen in silence long after the salute ended. Rain rolled endlessly down the dark windows overlooking the runway while the storm outside painted flashes of pale light across the ceiling every few seconds. Lieutenant General Victor Hale stood beside the old Marine's table with the rigid posture of a man trying very hard to keep certain emotions locked behind discipline. Around him, officers and military police remained perfectly still. Nobody dared interrupt. Captain Ryan Cole felt suddenly aware of every careless word he had spoken during the last half hour. The laughter, the mocking questions, the patch. His stomach tightened harder with each passing second. General Hale slowly removed his cover and placed it beneath one arm. His eyes never left Elias Mercer. "Do you know," Hale said quietly, "how many times people tried to find you?" Elias gave the faintest shrug. "Enough that I stopped answering mail." A few Marines exchanged uncertain glances. The general almost smiled at that, but it vanished quickly beneath something heavier. "You vanished after Da Nang," Hale continued. "No interviews, no reunions, no recognition ceremonies. Nothing." Elias looked down at the coffee mug resting between his weathered hands. Some things were not meant to follow men home. The words settled heavily over the room. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs watched younger Marines slowly beginning to understand that they were standing in the presence of something larger than rank. Larger even than military reputation. The kind of figure that became legend because nobody could fully explain what they had done. Captain Cole finally found his voice again, though it sounded weaker now. "Sir," he said carefully toward General Hale. "With respect, who exactly is he?" Every eye in the mess hall shifted toward the four-star general. Hale remained silent for a moment while thunder rolled low outside over the Pacific coast. Then he turned slowly toward the younger Marines gathered around the table. 43 years ago, Hale said, before most of you were born, an entire reconnaissance unit disappeared during a storm operation near the border. The room stayed perfectly still. Elias Mercer closed his eyes briefly as if hearing old rotor blades somewhere very far away. Hale continued quietly. Communications failed. Navigation failed. Weather collapsed on top of the extraction zone. 3 helicopters turned back. He paused. One did not. Captain Cole swallowed hard. Hale looked toward Elias again. The pilot refused to leave Marines behind. Nobody moved. Nobody even shifted weight. The only sound was rain striking the runway glass. That pilot, Hale said softly, was him. Several younger Marines stared openly now at the old man sitting quietly beneath the fluorescent lights. But Hale was not finished. The weather that night was so bad command officially called the mission impossible. His voice roughened slightly. Iron Viper flew anyway. Elias said nothing. His weathered face remained calm, but Briggs noticed the old veteran's thumb slowly rubbing the edge of the coffee mug, as though tracing memories no one else could see. Hale exhaled slowly. 27 Marines came home because he ignored direct orders and stayed in the air. Captain Ryan Cole felt something cold settle into his chest. Because General Hale was not speaking about the old man with admiration alone. He was speaking with the kind of gratitude men carried for the rest of their lives. One of the younger lance corporals whispered softly, almost without meaning to, "Sir, you were there?" Hale nodded once without taking his eyes off Elias. "I was 23 years old," he said, "and terrified." A faint flicker of lightning illuminated the room again. Elias finally looked up toward him. "You were young," he said quietly. "That is not the same thing." The general let out a breath through his nose that almost sounded emotional before discipline flattened it away again. Captain Cole lowered his eyes toward the floor, unable to look directly at the old Marine anymore. Every joke he had made now replayed inside his head with brutal clarity. The faded patch, the mocking laughter, the sarcastic smile. And through all of it, Elias Mercer had never once tried to defend himself, because men like him apparently did not need to. No one in the mess hall moved after General Hale finished speaking. The storm outside had become a steady roar now, rain sweeping sideways across the runway under harsh floodlights while the convoy vehicles remained idling beyond the windows like dark watchtowers. Captain Ryan Cole stood rooted beside the table, his face drained of color beneath the fluorescent glow overhead. He could still hear his own voice from earlier echoing in his head. Grandpa 1. Comic book villain. Gas station logo. Every word now felt heavier than the soaked air pressing against the glass outside. Elias Mercer slowly lifted the coffee mug again, taking a small sip as though the entire room had not frozen around him. The movement somehow made the silence even more powerful. General Hale glanced around the mess hall at the younger Marines, watching with wide, uncertain eyes. Most of them had grown up on stories about technology, precision warfare, satellites, drones, advanced systems. Men like Elias Mercer belonged to another age entirely. An age of unreliable radios, bad weather, instinct, and impossible decisions made in darkness. Hill looked back toward the old Marine. There are still instructors teaching your extraction routes at Quantico, he said quietly. Elias gave the faintest shake of his head. Then they are teaching old maps. No, Hale replied. They are teaching judgment. That landed differently. Even the youngest Marines in the room understood what those words meant coming from a four-star general. Captain Cole finally forced himself to speak again. Sir, he said carefully, his voice rougher now, why was none of this public? Hale turned slowly toward him. Because some operations were never officially acknowledged. Cole swallowed hard. Hale continued. And because some men never wanted attention afterward. Elias stared quietly through the rain-covered windows, while distant runway lights shimmered across the glass. The ones who did not come home deserved more attention than we did, he said softly. Nobody answered that. General Hale lowered his eyes briefly before reaching into the inside pocket of his dress coat. Several Marines instinctively straightened again as he removed a small weathered object wrapped in faded cloth. Hale unfolded it carefully against the table beside Elias's coffee mug. A tarnished metal compass. Old enough that the brass edges had darkened nearly brown with age. Captain Cole frowned slightly. Hale touched the compass once with 2 fingers. You gave me this during the storm operation, he said quietly. Elias looked at the object for a long moment without speaking. I thought you lost that. Almost did. Hale's expression softened faintly. But you told me something that night. The general's voice lowered further. You said when radios fail and maps fail, Marines still need something steady to follow. The old veteran's eyes remained fixed on the compass. Outside, thunder rolled across the coast again. You remembered that? Elias asked quietly. Hale gave a small breath through his nose. Sir, he said, I built my entire command philosophy around it. Captain Ryan Cole looked from the compass to the general and then back toward Elias Mercer, sitting silently beneath the fluorescent lights. And suddenly he understood something that unsettled him more than anything else that night. The old man had not simply saved Marines once. He had shaped men who later shaped the entire Corps. One quiet decision passed down through generations like a hidden current beneath the institution itself. Around the room, younger Marines stood completely silent now. No whispering, no shifting, just rain, fluorescent hum, and the steady, distant growl of helicopters outside the storm. Finally, Captain Cole stepped forward slowly toward the table. His voice came lower than before. Smaller. Mr. Mercer, he said carefully, I owe you an apology. Elias looked up at him calmly. The old Marine's pale eyes carried no anger in them. No triumph either. Just exhaustion worn smooth over decades. Cole straightened unconsciously as if standing before somebody far higher in rank than himself. I spoke to you without respect, he said. And I was wrong. The room waited. Elias studied the young captain for a few seconds while rain streaked across the windows behind him like blurred silver lines. Then he gave the faintest nod once. Nothing dramatic. No speech. No lecture. just quiet acceptance from a man who had long ago stopped needing victories over younger men. The storm finally began to weaken sometime after midnight. Rain still drifted across the runway outside Camp Pendleton, but the thunder had moved farther out over the Pacific, leaving behind only the low, steady hiss of wet tires and distant rotor blades somewhere beyond the darkened hangars. Inside the mess hall, nobody seemed eager to leave. Marines remained standing quietly around the tables, as if afraid movement alone might break whatever invisible weight had settled over the room. Elias Mercer slowly rose from his chair for the first time since General Hale arrived. The old maintenance jacket creased softly at the shoulders as he stood, and for a brief second his age became more visible than before. 82 years carried in tired joints and weathered hands. Yet somehow the room still seemed smaller around him. General Hale immediately stepped aside to give him space, without even thinking about it. That detail did not escape anyone watching. Captain Ryan Cole lowered his eyes briefly as Elias reached for the faded jacket hanging across the chair. The old Marine slipped it on carefully, fingers brushing across the worn serpent patch stitched into the sleeve. A symbol nearly invisible now beneath decades of sun and rain and silence. Hale looked at the patch for a long moment. "You know," the general said quietly, "there are young Marines who still ask whether Iron Viper was real." A faint smile touched the corner of Elias's mouth for the first time all night. "Small, tired, gone almost immediately. That is probably for the best." Several younger Marines watched him with expressions somewhere between awe and confusion. They had expected legends to look larger, louder, sharper. Instead, the man standing before them looked like somebody who repaired generators near the flight line and drank bad coffee alone during storms. But perhaps that was the lesson none of them would forget afterward. General Hale glanced toward the convoy, still waiting outside the rain-streaked windows. "I can have transportation arranged for you," he offered. Elias shook his head once. "No need, sir," Hale replied carefully. "It would be an honor." Elias looked toward the runway lights, shimmering across wet pavement. "I spent enough years riding in military vehicles." That drew the faintest breath of laughter from a few older Marines nearby. Even Captain Cole managed a weak smile before it disappeared beneath lingering embarrassment. The young captain stepped forward again as Elias adjusted the collar of his jacket. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "I really am sorry." Elias studied him for a second. Rain tapped softly against the glass behind them while helicopters moved like distant shadows across the airfield. "You are young, Captain," he said calmly. "The Corps will fix that eventually." A few Marines lowered their heads, hiding brief smiles. But Elias's voice carried no cruelty in it. Only experience. Only truth worn smooth by time. Captain Cole nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." And this time the word "sir" sounded earned. General Hale picked up the old brass compass from the table and carefully pressed it back into Elias's hand. Their fingers closed around the tarnished metal for one quiet moment beneath the fluorescent lights. "You gave a lot of Marines direction," Hale said softly. "More than you know." Elias looked down at the compass resting in his palm. The brass surface reflected pale runway light through the rain-covered windows. "Everybody needs direction eventually," he murmured. Then he slipped the compass into his jacket pocket and turned toward the exit. No dramatic farewell. No speech. No final revelation. Just the soft sound of old boots crossing tile floor while dozens of Marines silently stepped aside to clear a path for him. Elias Mercer walked slowly toward the doors beneath the dim overhead lights, shoulders slightly bent with age, but carrying a presence that filled the entire room long after he passed. At the entrance, he paused briefly beside the rain-darkened glass. Outside, the storm clouds were finally breaking apart over the Pacific. Then, without another word, the old Marine disappeared into the night. For several long seconds, nobody inside the mess hall moved at all, not even General Hale. The room remained silent except for distant helicopters and the steady rhythm of rain fading over the runway. Because every Marine standing there understood something now that no classroom or training manual could properly teach. The strongest men were often the quietest ones in the room, and some names were never meant to be spoken loudly for the world to remember them.